Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 14 and don't worry if you haven't seen any of the other videos in this series. I will link a playlist at the top of the screen so that you can go back and catch up. We're making a garden quilt, a block a week, and this week we have got a slightly different setup because we're going to refresh our cutting and piecing skills. So you can see I've got my cutting mat in the background, and this is a 1 centimetre cutting mat, and it's quite helpful because every 5 centimetres we get these thicker lines that help us count and position our fabrics really easily. Now, to help me with my cutting, I've also got a quilting ruler. Now, this is a steel-edged ruler, and this is also measured in centimetres. So each of these little squares is 5mm, and that makes it really easy for me to line up my ruler with my cutting mat and measure accurately without actually having to measure anything. I've also got my embroidery scissors and my rotary cutter. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you can just use scissors, but I do find that they give a really nice crisp edge and make cutting really easy. I've got some of my daisy trim, and we used this back when we did our birdhouses block, and I thought it might be nice to let that feature again in today's block. I've got some of my embroidery threads that I've been using. At the moment I've got blue, which is 130, pink, which is Anchor 025, I believe, and I've got my white, which is 001. I will add a couple of other colours in, but I'll let you know in the description below. I've also got some of my offcuts of fabrics, and these have all been used. You can see there's a big chunk missing out of this yellow one, but they are big enough to be able to cut my pieces out of, so I've got a selection of those. And I've also got some machine cotton, and this is going to help me piece my blocks together. So I thought we'd start by refreshing our cutting skills. So I've got a piece of my pink here, and this is a 20 centimetre square block. So you can see that it's 20 centimetres across and 20 centimetres down. I'm just going to line up my fabric square along that thick line on the right and along the thick line at the top, and you can see that it is cut fairly accurately into a square. Now, for this first panel for our block, I want to cut a piece of fabric that is 20 centimetres deep by 11 centimetres wide. So I'm going to start counting at this right hand side. I'm going to move along 5 centimetres to the next thick line, then another 5 centimetres to the next thick line, and then I want to add an extra 1 centimetre, and I just want to line up my ruler at the top and bottom, making sure that I've counted accurately. So I'm just going to double count because it's always better to cut once. So I've got 5, 10 and 11. I'm going to push down my blade on my rotary cutter. You should always raise the blade every time it's not in use. These are hugely sharp. You can do some real damage to yourself with them if you're not careful. And I'm just going to roll my rotary cutter along there, and that has cut my piece to exactly the size that I want in a neat line. Now I want a really thin strip of dark green in the middle of my block. So this one I'm going to cut 20 centimetres deep. You can see the block is already 20 centimetres deep, and I want to count 6 centimetres across. So I've got that first 5 centimetres up to the thick line, and then I've just added an extra 1, and I'm making sure that my ruler is lined up at the top and the bottom, double counting again, and then I can just roll my rotary cutter across and cut that really neatly. It is quite tricky for me rotary cutting because I'm sitting down, and it's much better to rotary cut when you're standing up so that you can get over the blade while you're rolling it. That's my second piece, and I've got my yellow in, and this is a little bit of a scrappy piece, but you can see I have got a 20 centimetre depth there and a straight edge, and I only want quite a shallow piece here. So this one I want to cut at 7 centimetres. I've got the 20 centimetre depth there, and I want 7 centimetres across, so I've counted twice, lined up my ruler on the 7 centimetre line, and I'm just rotary cutting across. I do need an e-blade. You can see it's just missed one thread there on the fabric, and so I'm just going to snip that with my scissors. And that's my pieces. So as long as you prep properly and line up your fabric with the grid on your cutting mat, you can measure really simply with your ruler. If you're left-handed, you'll need to work from the left-hand side. I'm right-handed, so I want my cutting blade on the right of my ruler, so I'm working from the right. So while everything's out, I'm just going to measure my seam allowances. So again, I've lined up my spot fabric, I've flipped it so that I'm now working on the back of the fabric, and I'm just going to line my ruler up 1 centimetre in from that right hand edge. I'm using my water erase pen because I'm going to iron it and I don't want the lines to disappear, and I'm just marking a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Now my green piece is going to go in the centre of my block, so I'm going to mark a seam allowance on both sides of this piece. It's going to be quite tricky to see this blue ink on the dark green fabric, but I think it will be just visible enough for me to be able to work with it. So just measuring my 1 centimetre line on both sides. And the pink, I just want 1 seam allowance marked, so I'm just going to pop that in there. So I've got rid of my cutting mat, and now we want to piece our panel together. So I'm going to start by lining up my green fabric along the pink there, and I just want to make sure that the edges are nice and straight and lined up with each other. I want to get this as accurate as possible. I'm putting my pins in perpendicular to the edge that I'm going to stitch, because when we put pins in, it causes a natural pucker where we've looped the pin through the fabric. If we put them straight, we're going to shorten the length of the edge that we're going to sew, and that could end up with us having a block that is lumpy or just not quite the right size. So if we put our pins perpendicular, it means that the puckers are going against the direction that we're sewing in, and keeps everything a bit more even. I've just got my machine cotton here, and I'm working on the green side just so that you can see it a little bit better. I've got a quilter's knot in the end of my thread, and I'm just going to back stitch this along that guideline that I've stitched. So just as a refresher on back stitch, I'm going to bring my thread through from the back about a stitch length in from the right hand side, and then I'm going to work backwards. So I'm going to go a stitch length back to the right and take my needle down, and then I've rocked my needle forward 1 stitch length beyond where the thread first came out. So now I've got a gap that I've created. So I've got my stitch length on the right hand side, and then a space, and then my thread is coming out a stitch length further on. So now I'm going to go back again to the beginning of that first stitch and take my needle back down through the fabric, and that creates my second stitch. So now I'm going to come up again 1 stitch length on from that previous stitch and go back to the end of the previous stitch to form my back stitch. Then I'm rocking my needle forward again, leaving a gap, and then working back to the end of the previous stitch. So I'll rock forward, leaving a gap, and then work back to the end of the previous stitch. And I'm just going to work all the way along my line in that way, keeping my stitches nice and even, and you can see there that it forms a really neat crisp edge. I'm not worrying about the seams on the back just yet. I'm going to add in my yellow now, so I'm going to do exactly the same process. I'm pinning my yellow piece to my green piece. Don't want to use too many pins, but you can see that I'm working perpendicular to the stitch line again, and then I bring back in my machine thread, and I'm just going to work a line of back stitch again in exactly the same way. So it's actually really straightforward. You will be able to see when I start opening out these seams that there is a little bit of unevenness at the edge, but it's not anything to worry about. So now I've brought my ironing pad back in, and I want to iron my seams flat. Now, if we iron up the green to the pink, there's a danger that our green fabric is going to show through on the pink, so I'm going to iron to the dark fabric. So that means pushing the pink seam down onto the green, and I'm ironing it on the back and the front, and then the yellow is exactly the same, so we're ironing the yellow up to the green and flattening out those seams. Now you can press the seams open if you want to, but because I've got my eye on how we're going to quilt this later on in the year, I want to create a solid piece of fabric behind those seams, so that's why I'm ironing it in that way. It's entirely personal preference, entirely up to you. So now I'm going to put some of my daisy trim over that seam at the bottom. So this is going over the seam between the green and the yellow, and I realised that I needn't have done an overlap here. I could have saved myself 2 daisies. It's not too big a deal. I've just cut a piece of braid there that is just slightly wider than the fabric. It's so close to the edge of the fabric that I could have just taken a daisy off each side and not wasted any, but I don't know what I was thinking. I think I was starting to not feel very well when I was making this block, so bear with my mistakes. And I'm just going to pin it in place just to help me position it, and I'm just going to make sure that that horizontal band of petals at the centre of the braid is sitting on my seam line. So that's just going to hold that in place for the time being. I've got my machine cotton again, and although it is quite a bit of stitching, I'm going to stitch down every single petal on this daisy braid. You could run a machine along the centre, but I quite like just using the petals. There's a little ridge down the centre of the petals, and I'm just bringing my needle up inside that ridge on the petal and then taking it back down right at the end of the petal, so that I'm just catching the backing fabric. So I'll come up on the petal and go down just on the backing fabric. So it's effectively an applique stitch, which we've used lots of times before, but this time we're just working our way around the braid, and that's going to keep it really secure, because this is going to be a quilt that's going to be used and washed, and I don't want any loose bits on my quilt that could get damaged or cause things to be lifted off with wear and tear. So you can see I'm just working my way around the right hand side of that daisy just to attach it to the yellow fabric, and I'm going to then just stay on that right hand side. So I'm moving on to my next daisy, and I'm just readjusting as I go, smoothing it out with my thumb. I'm going to work all the way down that right hand side and then work back up the left hand side. So I've stitched that all into place now, and you can see I've trimmed those daisies at the edge. So I've trimmed it back to the edge of the fabric, and I thought we could put some embroidery in. So I've got 2 strands of my white thread here, and we're going to learn a new stitch this week. We're going to learn tulip stitch, and that is a combination of a chain stitch and a fly stitch. So we're going to put our chain stitch in the space between 2 of the daisies, and then that little anchor stitch at the bottom of the chain stitch is going to also anchor a fly stitch. So we're going to work these in the spaces between the daisies, a little chain stitch with a fly stitch underneath it. So it's going to look like some little tulips, if you like, in between. So I've got my 2 strands of white thread, and I'm going to come up at the top of that little circle that I've drawn, that little oval, and we're going to make a detached chain stitch. So I'm going to take my thread round in a loop and go back down where the thread came out. Then I'm going to rock my needle forward and come out at the bottom of the oval and inside that loop, and that means that when I pull through, I catch that loop and create a little teardrop shape like that. Then I hop over the thread at the bottom of the loop and put in a little anchor stitch to hold that in place. So now we're going to use that anchor stitch to hold a fly stitch. So I've brought my needle up just halfway down my detached chain stitch on the left hand side, and I'm going to slide my needle under that anchor stitch. I'm not going through the fabric, I'm just tucking under the stitch, and then I go down back through the fabric opposite where I've just come out on the right hand side of my chain stitch, and so there we've got that little V at the bottom, and that's essentially a tulip stitch. Now I'm going to vary my colours, so I'm going to secure my thread on the back there. I'm going to work each of these stitches individually, so I'm just going to show you that again. I've got 2 strands of pink here, and again I'm going to work my chain stitch by taking my thread round in a loop, taking my needle back down where the thread came out, rocking my needle forward to the bottom of that chain stitch and coming out inside the loop, and then I hop over the stitch and make a little anchor stitch, come through on the left hand side of my chain stitch, slide my needle underneath that anchor stitch and take my needle back down on the right hand side, and that's my next little tulip stitch. Secure my thread on the back, and now I've got 2 strands of blue, so again round in a loop and back down where the thread came out, rock forward to the bottom of the oval and come up inside that loop, hop over the bottom of the loop to make my anchor stitch, and then come up on the left hand side, slide my needle underneath that anchor stitch and take my needle back down on the right hand side. And I'm going to use the colours that we've used before, so I'm going to use my red, which is anchor 46, and my yellow, which is anchor 298, and I'm just going to jumble these up, mix them up and put in tulip stitches all along the top and the bottom. So that's all our embroidery done, really simple this week, and that's essentially our panel. But I thought it might be nice to join this, make another paired panel and join this onto another block. So here's our block from last week. This was our trees from last week, and it's going to sit up here. I'm just going to square off my blocks just to make sure that I'm working with straight edges and right angles. So I've brought my cutting mat back and my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I've just lined it up with my grid. You can see that there is going to be some adjustment needed here when I come to stitch this together, but it's not too big a deal. We're leaving really generous seam allowances here, so we just want to make sure each block is as close to 20 centimetres square as possible. So I'm just trimming off my edges up to those 20 centimetre lines, taking off any rough bits and just squaring it off. And I've done the same with my tree panel as well. And I just want to mark in my 1 centimetre seam allowance because that's going to guide me when I'm joining these blocks together. I'm using my heat erase pen this time because once I've sewn it I won't need this line anymore. So the trees block is going to sit above the piece block that we've made. So I'm just going to put my trees block where it's going to sit and then flip it forward, and that will make sure it's the right way up. And then I'm going to stitch it together just in exactly the same way that we pieced our stripy block that we've made earlier. So I'm pinning the panels together and then going along with a back stitch. And I've pulled out my ironing mat again, and these are fairly similar colour values on these blocks, so I want to be consistent with what I've done with other blocks that are going to go beside it, and I'm going to press the seams down towards the pink. So just pressing it on the front just to make sure that is properly pressed out, and that's our block joined together. So the last thing I'm going to do is add some more daisy braid. So again, I've overcooked it and cut too much, so I was kicking myself after this for wasting 4 daisies worth of braid, but I've kept them and they might feature somewhere else on the quilt. And I'm just going to attach that in exactly the same way that I attached it earlier, and using a plique stitch to pin it down. So that is our double block for this week. This is our paired block. We've got our trees with some daisy braid joining it onto our striped tulip stitch block, and so there's another paired block to add to the other ones that we've done so far. So I hope you've enjoyed that little refresher on how to make a pieced block, and we've learnt a new stitch as well this week. I can't wait to see what your blocks look like. Do share them at hashtag FSH23quilt so that we can all see each other's quilts. And that's it for this week. If you've enjoyed this video and want to do something similar, I'll link a video down here. I'll put a video up here that's best for you. And if you'd like to subscribe, we'd love to have you as part of our community. It means so much to us. Just click on our logo down here and it makes it really easy for you. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!